Good evening. Welcome to April's gathering of the Calumet Nature Exchange. Please advise if a teacher wishes to earn professional development credit. I am recording this evening's session and it will be available on Ollie's website within a week. Tonight, we will be listening to a talk given last November by Dr. Philip Scarpino, and that was at the second Quinquennial Research Summit on the Wolf Lake watershed. The all-day conference was held in conjunction with the 5th annual Wolf Lake Watershed Advisory Committee meeting. It was during the final discussion at the 3rd annual Advisory Committee meeting that the Calumet Nature Exchange was formed. So this evening speaker, Dr. Scarpino. Our stage.
I'm not a biologist. If you look up Scarpino, you'll find a biologist, my son, but not me. I am an environmental historian. I got out of the Army a long time ago, went to graduate school because it was better than the Army. And at the same time that I showed up at the University of Missouri, the history department there hired a young faculty member named Susan Plowder, who was one of the first environmental historians in the country. I took a class with her as soon as I saw what she was teaching. I said, I'm going to work with that woman. And I did, and eventually got my PhD in environmental history. Wrote a dissertation on the upper Mississippi River, came a book, and since then, I've been working on the idea of the Anthropocene and publishing in the area of water and human impact on the environment. So that's me, and I'm here to give kind of a bigger picture of the relationship between people and wetlands over time. I'm not an expert on the local area up here on Wolf Lake. I will be when rain gets on it, but right now I'm going to give kind of a big picture. So I'm going to give an environmental context. This is, of course, I'm sure most of you know better than I do what this is. It's an aerial view of Wolf Lake, and one of the things it shows, of course, just how modified this place is by human action. So I want to begin with kind of a long view, and I'm going to end up with how we ended up eliminating about 90-some% of the wetlands in Indiana, and I assume in Illinois as well. But the long view begins with the fact that from the colonial period to the 20th century, going to the 19th century, Americans settled the land and in the process transformed it into something much different than it originally was. So because this is a visual presentation, I'm using an image done by a woman artist named Fanny Palmer. One of the few women artists in the 19th century who got any recognition, although she often get paid for her work. She did this piece called Immigrants Crossing the Plains in 1866, published by Currier and Ives, like hard people. Because Currier and Ives published it that way, everybody was looking at it. So it reflected the way, and influenced the way Americans viewed nature. You see the settlers, headed off in their wagons, and the Native Americans, they're watching them, and they're out there going to conquer the wilderness, right? A few years later, she does another one called Across the Continent, and the next step, of course, is that Americans transformed that wilderness into civilization. You can see the wagons in between the homes. You see the train, the telegraph representing the future. And there are the poor Native Americans off on the right-hand corner that smoke the locomotive, and that's not an accidental symbol there. So, all right. So what? That's the most important question you can ever ask. So what? Why does any of this stuff matter? And why it matters is because people imagine and transform their surroundings by acting on their values that are culture. That's why we do things. So the question then becomes, what values? What are we talking about here? And I'm going to look at two sets. One is 19th century into the early 20th, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental movement, which was a game changer. Right? So quickly, cluster of attitudes and really shape the way people interacted with their surroundings and transformed. And we'll start with God, right? Religion of God. People believe that God created human beings superior to the rest of nature. They believe that God gave nature to humanity for its use, right? That's what it existed for. And therefore, nature exists to serve people. That's the purpose. Right? So, just so you realize that I didn't make it up. I actually teach it in Sunday school. I also got thrown out of Sunday school. That's a different story. My sister said, Jesus can do anything. And I was about 9, and I thought I could run with this. I put up my hand and said, "You make a monkey come with people. Get out of here." I called my father to come and get me and explain why I got pitched out of Sunday school. So, I mean, he's the only guy I ever met out of Sunday school. So anyway, roots in Judeo-Christian tradition. In Genesis, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." That's pretty comprehensive. So there was the idea that land and resources could be owned as private property. That's a big difference between the folks who were originally here, indigenous people. And proof of ownership is an improvement. Not enough just to own it, you cut down the trees, put in fields, put up a barn, put up a house, raise livestock. That's the proof. Nature is a collection of commodities that have an abstract monetary value in the market. Didn't mean that people in the 19th century didn't like sunsets and lakes and stuff. But when you read what they say when they're looking at nature, what they're seeing is timber and minerals and potash and stuff people could use. So this triumvirate of property, commodity, and market is powerfully transformed. When people acted on those values, we literally changed basically. Part of what they changed created the little place there today. There's a belief that nature is infinite. People believe there was always more. Maybe you could use it up here, but there was more there. Right? And when you believe that nature is infinite, you act in a way that most people don't act in the present. The idea that nature has to be conquered and controlled in the name of progress and civilization. And you read documents in the 19th century into the early 20th century, they read like people were going to war. They use terms like conquer and defeat and subdue. And then nature could be divided into bad and good. We're not talking any ecosystem integrity here. We're talking about good species and bad species. The idea is to minimize or get rid of the bad ones and to maximize or enhance the good ones. Right. So then through this cluster of traditional values, in this context, wetlands were waste. They were unusable waste. So the value was derived from draining to produce productive land, agriculture, homes, communities. But as they sat, from this point of view, they were just wasting space. So the second concept that I use to understand some place in which we live, it's actually an idea that came out of museum studies, and I kind of expanded on it significantly. And the definition of material culture written by an archaeologist named James, he's a brilliant guy, said, but he said, material culture is that portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plans. If you think about that for a minute, sort of wrap your mind around it, the conclusion you reach is that in the world in which we live, there is no place left on earth that is not that. There is no place on the earth that has not been modified by human action. I don't know, maybe there's some square portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plan. So if we think about the history of human interaction with the environment, northern Indiana, northern Illinois, in the Midwest, in the United States, around the world, then what we realize is that attitudes embedded in culture go a long way toward explaining why people altered and transformed the environment in the way that they did. There are reasons why people did that. And in fact, very rarely do people ever set out to deliberately inflict damage. Maybe you go to war and then you want to inflict damage, but people almost always believe that whatever they're doing is going to do some beneficial result. So then when we add in the unintended and unanticipated consequences of people's actions, we begin to have an analytical framework for examining the relationship over time. So unintended means you didn't mean it, and unanticipated means you didn't see it coming. And when we're talking about the relationship between people and their surroundings over time, those are important variables. People sometimes set out to do something in particular, but often what's most transformative is what they didn't mean to have happen or what they didn't see happen. So I want to give you an example of Americans acting on the attitude embedded in their culture and how environmentally transformative they were. I'm going to use forests as an example, and we're talking people removing forests, not so much for lumber, but removing trees to replace them with farmland. So literally people hated trees. So I'll give credit where credit's due. These drawings that I'm about to show you were originally prepared by a guy named William Greeley, who was the third chief of the U.S. Forest Service in 1920 and 1926. You can bet he didn't do it himself. Probably all these stats, people looking all this stuff up, and then when they're all done making these lovely maps, he put his name on it, and a few years later died. So this is a map of what they constructed, area of what they call virgin forest in what is now the United States in 1620. What they meant is uncommon. And you can see what you would pretty much expect. Most of the eastern half of the U.S., parts of the Mountain West, and the Pacific. Now watch what happened. 1850. That's forest removal. Mostly, again, not for lumber, but for farmland. The West is still pretty much untouched. The Northeast and the East Coast, pretty well forested. 1926. There's some forest left in the Rocky Mountain West, that's where most areas are now. And in fairness, since this thing was done, there has been some recovery of forestation. My brother finished career as a forester, and in Connecticut, I used to tease him about carrying the one tree in Connecticut. But actually, Connecticut's forestry found quite a bit in my lifetime. Right. Indiana, I don't have a map like this for Illinois, but this one I had. And what this shows is environmental transformation. Begin with that idea, that portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plan. If you look at the map on the left, right, you can see that Indiana at one point was 9% wetlands, and most of it was up here, right? 3% agricultural, 88% forested, right? And then we jump ahead to 2001, and we see that Indiana is 63% agricultural, 23% forested, wetlands would be 2%. But that took a huge hit. Largely because thought they were a waste of space, and what to do with wetlands is ground was training to make them into productive land. You can replant a forest a lot easier than you can rewater a wetland. All right, so environmental transformation, acting on values embedded in culture. But stick in a local example here. Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, I'm sure you know what that is, 28 miles long, connected the Chicago River to the Plains River. It was originally completed in 1900. Now it's a long time to do, but it opened in 1900. And it was really intended to put the waterways to work. Work doing what? The Chicago sewage. They had been dumping their sewage in Lake Michigan. The sewage plume was extending into the lake faster than they could extend the water, the intake of clean water. So what are we going to do with the sewage? We'll flush it downriver. And so that's what happened. And we also added the Cal-State channel into that. But basically, not only did that redirect the flow to the river, but they basically became both navigation channels and sewage drainage systems. Large scale environmental transformation. I just like the picture of each other. I put it up here. Right. So post-World War II environmental movement. What makes that significant? Well, we just call it my environmental history class as it has produced. You can say far outlook the environment. There was more to it than that. The environmental movement was really a challenge for the traditional method. It was a challenge to those traditional values in ways that drove really important grassroots movements. The environmental movement didn't come from the top down, it came from the bottom up. Eventually it reached science and became institutionalized in State Department of Conservation. But when that movement got going, it was people in the streets, regular people from the bottom up. So if you look at this picture that I showed you before, banning farmers across the continent, and think about what that says about nature, and what that says about wilderness, which is get rid of wilderness and transform nature, make it productive. Compare it with this. Nearly a century later, the Wilderness Act, released in 1964, passed by the U.S. Congress. There were some no votes, but there were actually Republicans who voted yes on this. Democrats controlled Congress. 88th Congress, September 3rd, 1964, signed by President Johnson. Why does this matter? Congress people, presidents don't do things unless they think they have a constituency. Rarely do they get ahead of the voters very far if they want to get reelected. The Congress people who passed believe this is what their constituents want, or at least a lot of it, and they were right. President Johnson signed that thing. He was one of the best politicians of his time. Equally, constituents wanted it, and his signature on that thing would not cost an election. Something else did, it wasn't this. So, wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrampled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Right? That's a huge contrast to that picture I showed you across. That reference to community of life, that's embedded ecologically, ecology in the law. And that's not there by an accident. That wouldn't, they got a focus group and somebody said, yeah, community of life sounds good, let's stick it in there. It's a direct reference to the ecological perspective. Huge, huge, huge change in the way many Americans thought about their surroundings. Big Fanny Palmer and the grassroots environmental factors that contributed to it. Post-war prosperity. Not everybody was doing well, but after World War II, most Americans were. And that's although Leopold, right, who referred to him, once said, conservation movement is a full belly movement. And people don't start to think about their surroundings in a serious way if they're hungry. If they don't have a job, they don't have a roof over their head. Post World War II prosperity, people had full bellies and they really began to think about this thing. Baby boom was underway. That actually lasted a long time. It was just, and then when we couldn't get together during the war, it was 2 weeks, it was then over. The baby boom actually lasted 6 months. I'm a baby boom kid. I was born in 1948. So baby boom, parents who were making all those children wanted to have a high quality environment for them to grow up in, a safe environment, right? A safe place for them to live. People were also concerned about the unintended and unanticipated consequences of technology. There are a whole range of new technologies developed during World War II. Okay. We got a whole range of synthetic organic compounds. DDT is one of them. So, concerns about the unintended and unanticipated consequences of technology. Atomic bombs, figures of fallout and radiation. Concerns about the widespread indiscriminate use of synthetic organic compounds. DDT works, right? It was the best, most effective insecticide ever developed, but the people who began using it didn't realize it bioaccumulated. So, and then we have popularized ecology, which from the scientific and philosophical understanding of environmental movement. And we're not talking hardcore science here, we're talking concepts like everything is connected to everything else. And those who make war on nature ultimately make war on themselves. That's how ecology influences the popular mind. Each level. So, bottom line, that the ecology-based environmental movement played a major role in redefining the purpose and value of wetlands, including those in the vicinity of Wolf Lake. Scientists and environmentalists in terms of ecological integrity. Wetlands in places like Wolf Lake took on value in and of themselves, not because they could be drained and turned into fields. But concerns that drove emergence, growth of the grassroots environmental movement, above ground testing of nuclear weapons. Folks are old enough to remember that. In case you kind of forgot, by 1951, the U.S. had exploded 16 bombs, the Soviets 13. They got into the game in 1962. Why did we care about this? Well, when they tested one of these things in the atmosphere, radiation, including strontium-90, was blasted into the stratosphere. It didn't stay there. Returned to Earth as fallout. Strontium-90 moves to the environment, something with calcium. I know. And you know, where do we find calcium? Milk, right? Who drinks the milk? All those children that are being produced by the baby boom parents. So the strontium-90 ends up in the teeth and bones of people, including those kids. It begins to create a powerful institution of change. Worries about the unintended and unanticipated consequences of new technology driving that environmental movement. Widespread indiscriminate use of DDT and other synthetic organic compounds. After World War II, they did consumer products. Right? That didn't mean you would eat it. That meant you go to the hardware store and you could buy all kinds of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, and take them home and use them. And what we found out, what people began to find out, is that works, but also bioaccumulants. So raised concern among the general public, the parents of baby boom people were particularly worried about the impact of this kind of stuff on their children. That's what drove the environmental movement. And it's the environmental movement that really changes the meaning and significance of wetlands in places like Wolf Lake, where it begins to talk about ecological integrity, matter. Popularizing an ecological perspective, that's what it's trying to say. I realize that it's somewhat controversial in scientific circles, but having powerful influence. Popular understanding. Powerful. Those are credentials. She was an extremely well-known writer, before she published out, right? She was a best-selling writer, 41, 51, 55 sounds, sprinkled down to 62. And here's what she told me. Along with the possibility of extinction of mankind by nuclear war, that's one of the first opening lines she's referenced what people are already afraid of. The central problem of our age has therefore become the contamination of man's total environment with substances of incredible potential for harm, substances that accumulate in tissues, plants, and animals, and even penetrate the germ cells and shatter or alter the very material of heredity upon which the shape of the future depends. That can be potential. Silent Spring is not about DDT. It's about a perspective. If it's just about DDT, we wouldn't care about it anymore. But I can tell you, focus on translated when I taught in China, it's a Chinese version. And I tested my students to read it, but they were getting better than mine. They didn't read it. But they could have if they wanted to. All right, so popular culture. Maybe somebody can remember a cartoonist named Bill Mulder. Right? Chicago Sun-Times. I love this cartoon. See the guy where he's dressed? This is Suburban Joe. That spurred off narrow tie, right? And he's using DDT and then a bunch of made up stuff, bye-bye fly, will kill, ACAT. Do you know what ACAT is? That's right, it's a World War II reference. It's in the aircraft on the ship. So none of this stuff is accidental, right? And he's using all this stuff, and you see the bug coming down like a fighter shot down, spin into the ground. A lot of symbolism here, but the basic line is the basic principle of the ecology-based environmental movement is those who make war on nature eventually make war on themselves. And this was published in Chicago, but it was syndicated all over the country. fact, human beings have so modified the earth that we may have entered a new geological epoch. The Anthropocene, in which human agency may become most important driving force of environmental change. Whether or not we've actually answered that topic, well, I've participated in international group of folks, including a lot of science people, who are pretty well convinced that that's where we're going. Paul Crutzen, I'm sure most of you know who he was. And two of the scholars who've been writing about the Anthropocene, Libby Robin and Will Stephan, a new geological epoch reflecting the scientific fact that anthropogenic change is now shaping planetary system. Describing changes to the Earth system over time demands understanding of the history of biological factors, human factors, and their integration. And the thing I like about this is recognize that science alone is not a complete explanatory factor. You also have to calculate what people think, believe, and care about, dream about, and want, what they've done, and what they want to do. Okay? And of course, this classic photo, I think you remember this, the blue marble photo, December 7th, 1972, when people looked at that. Okay? Hanging in the back. Wait, doesn't realize that's it. All of that. So, material culture and the Anthropocene that provide a way of understanding the profound role of intended and unintended human agency in shaping the creation of space over time. That includes the marshlands, full place. One more big picture, the International Panel on Climate Change. What I'm going to argue here is science alone is often not enough. If you read this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change fifth assessment report of 2014, it says science now shows with 95% certainty that human activity is the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century, right? Down full at about the same time. 73% of Democrats believe global warming is underway, and 56% thought it represented a serious threat to their life. 36% of Republicans believed it was underway, and only 19% thought global warming represented a serious threat to their life. This is not a slam on the Republicans and Democrats. It points out that science isn't enough. It doesn't matter that you just tell people this is true. You've got to penetrate that matrix of cultural beliefs that they claim to a lot tighter than science. All right. So with this framework in place, then I want to make some observations on full plate surrounding wetlands. Maybe if I can work on the project here. A lot more specific to say about Wolf Lake. But Wolf Lake obviously creates a place over time. In terms of environmental history, that's the story of Wolf Lake. It is a created place. Wolf Lake and its associated web of animal and plant life, the result of a long process of modification by people. Wolf Lake, I mean, there's natural stuff out there, but Wolf Lake is really a cultural artifact. It's really as much a human artifact as it can be not considered. And the Wolf Lake that exists now, there's almost no resemblance to what was there before. And I've got some illustrations that I borrowed from somebody you know, but I gave credit. This is a brilliant series of drawings, and it shows Wolf Lake, 1850, 1900, 1950, and 2000. And you can see here that in 1850, it was connected to Lake Michigan. By 1900, that connection doesn't exist anymore. You look at Lake George here, look at the way it changes over time. I mean, this has been engineered and re-engineered, shaped and reshaped over the course of the last, century and a half. This picture. Amazing what you can find on the internet. That's not Wolf Lake, by the way. I know it's not. I just couldn't think of it because I figured I ain't gonna get it. I'm gonna figure out a way to get the picture in it. No, it's not Wolf Lake. I want to talk about Wolf Lake as a cultural artifact. And I'm gonna both go. Wolf Lake, underneath there, completely disappeared, gradually changing into, what would have completely disappeared, gradually changing into field and later forest. This succession was interrupted as people colonized the area and modified the environment. Vegetation was removed and banks were stabilized. The lake bottom was dredged. Wolf Lake was essentially reset to an earlier time and the fish assemblages reflected. So I thought I actually knew a lot about the environment. I actually didn't know this until I read your piece, that Wolf Lake would have disappeared. It's there because of human action. So, including thoughts. Wolf Lake is a product of human action over time, and that fact really raises some management consideration. There is no returning Wolf Lake to what it once was, even if we could figure that out, right? So, from a historical perspective, then, we need to think about places like Wolf Lake present. And I would argue that the concepts of material culture in the Anthropocene have helped remove what have become increasingly artificially defined between natural history and human history. If you think about those course of natural history and human history over the past century, the distinction between them has blurred substantially. We still teach them separately in my environmental history class. Concept of material culture in the Anthropocene rests on a foundation of human agency. And to my mind, that puts them in the area of bailiwick, history, and social science that have something to say about both the process of what has become and thinking about what it could be in the future. I want to point out that human agency is not a single undifferentiated variable. Some of the science people who write have figured when they write about the Anthropocene, write about human culture, but human culture knows it's just that single variable. It's not. Culture differs from group to group. Cultures evolve over time. And if we're really going to understand human impact on the environment, then we also need to understand, in addition to science, we need to study and understand the historical mosaic of cultural context and shape of it. You know, it's one thing to say, well, no, we're going to do this and this in the water, but if you want to affect policy, you have to affect voters. And that means influencing the way they think. Influencing the way they think begins with how they think now. So we also need to pay attention to the unintended and unanticipated consequences of human action. Thinking of the interplay between people and their surroundings in terms of material culture and the Anthropocene highlights the fact that understanding the environment as it exists in the present are paying as much attention to history and culture as science. If we look at the interplay between people and the environment from a historical perspective, it invites us to ask a historical question. Why did people interact with nature and the surrounding environment the way they did? What motivated them? What did they expect to gain? And I put those up there because rarely do people ever set out to deliberately inflict damage. Almost always, thinking in terms of producing some social good, and the problems come with the unintended and unanticipated consequences. You know, who is in a position to make or influence decisions and who is not? Who benefited and who did not? And that gets into the area of environmental justice. Something worth considering as policy. What role do cultural differences play in shaping the relationship between people and place over time? Especially when groups with significant cultural differences disagree over what to do in the same place. Looking at the interplay between people and their environment through a historical or cultural lens. Additional questions. What role did memory play? What do people think about the place in which they live? And how did it influence the way they acted? How about factors like race, class, and gender? I didn't just stick that up there to be correct. I stuck it up there because we need to recognize that even for people living in the same place, they don't always experience the environment in the same way. It's not a uniform experience. So historically, what has been the relationship between identity and place? for most people, environment is not so much about the big macro issues like climate change. I guess some people care about that, yeah. What people really care about is the place in which they live, the local place. I was given a talk in New Mexico 2 years ago, and I said that, and one of the faculty members who was in the audience said, "Oh, come on." And so I just started asking the audience, most of them were students, what about this, what about this, what do you care about? It was all local. It wasn't climate change and that stuff. It was what's happening, on the edge of town, what about the dump, what about this, what about that? It was local. What were the unintended and unanticipated consequences of people's actions? How did people respond to those unintended and unanticipated consequences? And I would argue that these are important questions. And there's questions that history is well within to answer, but there are also questions that we should be answering if you think about managing, almost common property resources like wetlands and Wolf Lake, the northwestern part of Indiana, part of Illinois. I don't know anything else. Very much. You're listening to a historian at a science conference. Michael's distracted with lunch right now, but I'm sure if there's any questions.
Although the speaker's not here to answer questions, he will be
Somebody's flash drive is
a
up
speaker
there.
at Friday's evening event at the Peggy Noda Park.
This one was in
Museum.
there from before, so I don't know.
And thank you very much for attending tonight.